Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Emily Stewart, and I am the Assistant Director of the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute. And I'm so grateful and excited to be hosting this book event with such a good friend and community partner, Katherine Coleman Flowers, about her new book, Waste: One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret. And before we dive in, I'd like to thank the team of colleagues and students who have contributed who have contributed to and also been changed by the partnership with Katherine over the years. There are so many, and I imagine we will talk about some of them tonight. But I want to give special thanks to Professors Erica Weinthal and Betsy Albright and the whole FHI staff, especially Pam Montgomery and Mary Williams, for their support. And I'm also grateful for the colleagues who are helping tonight: Eric Barstow doing the Facebook live stream, Amanda Starling Gould on Zoom support, and for our student, Liu Wolden-Michael, for tweeting about tonight's conversation. And over the last year, students from the Native American Student Alliance, staff and faculty from Duke, UNC, NC State, and members of local Native nations have been participating in a land acknowledgement committee. And the purpose of this committee is to center Native students' intentions for using land acknowledgements and to consult with local Native tribes about the practice of using land acknowledgements in a university setting. I want to honor that we are still in this process, so I won't give a formal land acknowledgement tonight, but I invite everyone to learn more about the land you live on and the Native people who currently live there or who have historically lived there. The plan for this evening is for Katherine and I to talk for a little while and then open it up to your questions. So please feel free to send them to me throughout the event. You can just click on the chat and send me an email directly. And if you have any sort of technical questions about Zoom, please feel free to chat Amanda Starling Gould with your question. And just so everyone knows, there will be live captioning during the event. So let's go ahead and dive in. Katherine Coleman Flowers is an internationally recognized environmental activist, MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, and author. She has spent her career advocating for equal access to water and sanitation for all communities, particularly those who are marginalized. Katherine engages with and informs audiences on environmental justice and climate change. As founder of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, CREEJ, Katherine has spent her career advocating for equal access to clean water, air, sanitation, and soil in order to reduce health and economic disparities in marginalized rural communities. In addition, she serves as the Rural Development Manager for the Equal Justice Initiative. She's Senior Fellow for the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and sits on the Board of Directors for the Climate Reality Project and the Natural Resources Defense Council. We are lucky that she has been the practitioner in residence here at the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute. As author of Waste: One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret, Katherine shares her inspiring story of advocacy from childhood to environmental justice champion. She discusses sanitation and its correlation with systemic class, racial, and geographic prejudice that affect people across the United States. So, Katherine, it is so good to be with you tonight. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I wish this could be in person, hopefully soon.
I know, me too. Me too. I've really been looking forward to this opportunity to talk about your book. And even though we've been working together for years, I learned so much about your life from reading Waste. And I'm just wondering how it's felt like for you to put your story out there.
Wow, it's been kind of amazing because I did not expect people to respond to it the way they have. And I think by being vulnerable, it has helped me to develop some type of connectivity with people that I didn't know. So I've heard from so many people who could relate to certain parts of my story, if not all parts of my story, and have offered to be supportive in one way or the other as a result. But I felt in order for people to understand why I chose this particular subject matter, they had to understand who I was. And it would also help them to see and make the connections between all of those factors that contributed to us having sanitation issues throughout the United States.
Mhm. Yeah. And this book really feels like a journey about relationships, fighting for justice. Um, just kind of Lowndes County is the seeds for where your vocation were planted early on. And I kind of want to start there, if that's all right, to growing up in Lowndes County, and the importance of that place to you, because you write about being a country girl, and you talk about that a lot, a country girl at heart. Um, and grew up living close to the land and raised on homegrown food, and going to people's houses and never leaving without a dish or something that they had made. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to those country values and how they shaped who you are today.
Yes, I think that it was in Lowndes County where I learned a sense of community. We all have a sense of family, but when family extends beyond that to include people in the community, I think that's even more fantastic because I find it hard today to live in places or neighborhoods where I don't know people that live around me. But it wasn't like that when I grew up in Lowndes County. And everyone was, it was one of those places where, because my father was a native, where people could look at my face and tell which family I belonged to, and they can still do that to this day. If it's someone from Lowndes County, they see me, even if I'm not in Lowndes County, they'll look at me and say, "Oh, you're a Coleman." But that was one of the unique things about it. And in addition to that, it was one of those places where, at the time I grew up, everybody around was family or connected in some way. So uh, I did. My parents didn't have to worry about it if I was outside and I decided I was going to walk through the cornfields because, my favorite vegetable used to be corn because I could pick the corn from the stalk and open it up. And, when you peeled it back, a lot of people haven't seen fresh corn, but if you have fresh corn, there's milk coming out of it and you could bite into it and taste it. And now, some foods don't have any taste because of the way they bring food to market now. But I grew up knowing really what fresh corn tastes like, or being able to go out and pick berries. We had berries that just grew wild. Uh, Plum bushes were everywhere, and I could pick plums and eat plums. I didn't have to wait until my mother cooked a meal for me to go home and eat because it was already out there. And whenever everybody took pride, because most people had a garden, and everybody took pride in their garden, and whether they gave you fresh tomatoes or some people would take mason jars because they would can foods and put it away. And with the canned foods, they would give that to you, or some people would take the jars and grow peppers in them. I mean, my mother would take stuff. I didn't know that you can cut the top off of a potato and put it in the soil, and it would take roots and grow. So all these things I learned um, as a child. And my mother would, she cooked, and the food that she cooked, she made herself. I think the first time I had a pizza, I was in college, because everything that we had for the most part, was made at home. And I think now, to me, to have lived as long as I've lived and to be mostly healthy, I think it goes back to the time in which I was nourished with food from the earth as opposed to uh, processed foods. And I think that when we look back at what people now call being environmentally conscious, that we were environmentally conscious at that time. And that's why it wasn't hard for me to connect to the climate movement and to connect to understanding how we should be in balance with the earth, because growing up where I grew up, we had to be in balance with the earth.
Mhm. Yeah, I remember you often telling stories about kind of picking the fruits or eating the corn, and then also seeing how the landscape is changing over time, and really being able to make that connection with climate change. And in what you witnessed growing up and what's been changing on the land.
Yeah, I think that's one of the advantages of growing up in a rural community, uh, is that you have to, you have to recount, you have to look at the, because at that time when you were planting the garden, you had to know when to put those seeds in the ground. Because if you put it in there before, when it was too early and there was still frost on the ground, chances are that, it wasn't going to survive, wasn't going to grow right. But it was a very, very fertile area. And my parents also liked to fish, so you learn about what type of fish were native to that area. We would find things like, you mentioned this morning, you mentioned at the beginning, our indigenous brothers and sisters, we would often find arrowheads. And I didn't know, other than hearing my mother talk about her grandmother was Native American, I didn't know about the history in terms of the land and the connection there until later. But now I can see how it was, it was part of just the existence in places like Lowndes County, how people had to coexist with the land. And yeah, and it's very much in tune with where we should be right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually wanted to ask more about that because you talk a lot about the soil, and I was really moved by your description of the soil. And because you begin the book talking and describing the dark red soil that Black farmers have worked on for generations, and the soil holds that history of slavery, of racial terror, of violence, but also the rich history of resistance and resilience of Black communities. And you write about your connection to ancestors and the soil being in your blood. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the history of Lowndes County and the people you come from.
Well, the soil is I remember when when I went to college, one of the things they used to say, when they would joke us, they would say, they knew that those of us that were from the country, that they could still see the red dirt on our shoes. But but it was the history of Lowndes County is such that it was one of those places where there were lots of slaves. And when I look, genealogy is my is how I relax when I'm not working. And oftentimes when I'm on Ancestry and I'm looking at records, I look to see where people were from, where they were born. And a lot of people in Lowndes County were born either in North or South Carolina. A lot of them were born in South Carolina because the founders, the people that's not founders, but the people that settled there, they actually moved their plantations from South Carolina to Alabama and places westward because they were wearing out the soil. But Lowndes County's history is very important to Alabama because EJI, which I'm also a part of, has collected a lot of the history of the area and showing, for an example, that Montgomery was the heart of the slave trade in that area at one point. And a lot of the people that ended up in Lowndes County were enslaved people. In addition to that, Lowndes County has a rich indigenous history because it is where one of the Creek Wars was fought at the Battle of Holy Ground in Lowndes County. Not far from Lowndes County, along the Selma to Montgomery Marsh Trail on 80, there's a monument to where DeSoto and his men, when they came through the area, they were supposedly among the first white explorers to explore that area. But even later, at the end of the Civil War, African Americans in Lowndes County, despite all of the racial terror, tried to organize and control their own labor with the Sharecroppers Union. This Sharecroppers Union was put down by violence. At one point, W.E.B. Du Bois actually came to Lowndes County and did a labor study. He was at the Atlanta University at the time. And while he was there, he did a survey, something in which we've done together, Duke, in our local organization. And he did a survey of what was happening with labor there, but it was so explosive that the Department of Labor, which was funding at the time, wouldn't even release the public results. And then moving further into the civil rights movement in the 1960s, there was, most people know about the Selma to Montgomery March, but a lot of people were coming. They were actually going out into the Black Belt region, including Lowndes County during that time. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was very involved in working with local people. And these were mostly young people from across the United States, working with local people to help them organize for the right to vote. And out of that came the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which was the original Black Panther Party. And there were lasting connections that were made with young people that were from SNCC. And I think a lot of the way in which they organized were ways in which I was able to learn from and use today as I seek to organize in Lowndes County and in communities like Lowndes County. But its history is very, very rich, a history of resistance, but also a history of success and excellence. There's a person from Lowndes County, most people don't know this, who I think he went to MIT, but he went to Central High School, the school I talk about in my book. But he's younger than I am. But he actually patented and created a device to help propel the space shuttle. His father ran for sheriff on the Black Panther Party ticket, back in the 1960s. So there is excellence that has come out of Lowndes County again and again and again, but people don't get credit for it because they leave and then they always associate it with the area that they're from. So I think that if we go back in history and really make the connections of how many people have left Lowndes County have done exceedingly well, not just in sports, because everybody knows about Ben Wallace, who played for the Pistons. But there are a lot of people that have come out of Lowndes County and done well despite our history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I was really struck reading the book, kind of hearing you describe what it was like to sit out on the porch on, I believe it was Miss Shug's porch.
Miss Shug's porch, yes.
Meet these incredible activists, these SNCC volunteers who many times were risking their lives to be there and to register people to vote. And
Ms. Shug herself was an activist. So she would talk about how, because one of the ways in which they organized was through social and savings clubs, where people would get together, they would have parties on the weekend, they would save their money, and then they'd disperse it around Christmas so they could use it to buy gifts or whatever. And that was, what the students were able to do was find out how the local community was organized. So instead of just going to churches to organize, they also went and recruited people that were in the social and savings clubs. And Ms. Shug was in one of those social and savings clubs. And she was one of the people that was actively engaged and getting people registered to vote so that they could do what ultimately happened, which was bring about changes and have more people of color eventually assume elected positions in Lowndes County. Mm-hmm. But it came with a cost, because one of the things that Hassan Jeffries write about is Lowndes County's name, Bloody Lowndes, because it was always met with violence. And some would go as far as to say now that wasn't just met with violence, and now is met with neglect in terms of instead of making sure that people could thrive and prosper, but always putting in place systems that would keep the labor cheap. Mm-hmm. And that means keeping people poor by not putting investment in resources that are necessary for the county to thrive.
I'm wondering too, Catherine, do you mind talking a little bit more about your relationship with Bryan Stevenson when you met him and got involved with the Equal Justice Initiative and his work in looking at the soil and the history of lynching and what it means to be reckoning with the past as we do this work and move into the future, and how that informs your environmental justice work.
Well, I met Brian, actually, EJI was working in partnership with Partners in Health, and we're looking at the possibility of locating an office in Lowndes County. So I was contacted and asked, could they come and bring some of the lawyers and people from Partners in Health to come and meet with us in Lowndes County, and they did. And after the meeting, I was contacted and asked what could they do. And I said, I'd like to meet Bryan Stevenson, because I had seen the 60 Minutes report where, the famous, now his book is famous, Just Mercy, but I had seen the 60 Minutes report where he had helped to free Walter McMillian in Monroeville, who was accused of murder and was innocent. So to me, he was already a legend before, I guess, he became a national and international legend. Mm-hmm. And I requested a meeting with him. So when I got the date to go to the meeting, I really didn't want to change it, because it fell on the same date that I was supposed to go and get a repeat mammogram, because they had seen something on a mammogram. And, but I felt, I talk about my faith often, but I felt that I was supposed to meet Bryan Stevenson. So instead of going, I changed my doctor's appointment, my follow-up appointment, and I went to see him. And I was so nervous when I was sitting there waiting in the conference room for him to come in. I was thinking, like, what am I going to say to this guy? But when he walked in, he came over to me and he shook my hand and he said, Catherine, I've just been following you in the press. And I'm so proud of what you're doing, because I grew up in a home with raw sewage on the ground. And that shocked me, because I didn't know, because he wasn't from Lowndes County, he was from Delaware. And from that point on, and that day I was offered, he said, I would like to support your work. And I told him about, the choice I made that day. Instead of going to the doctor to find out about, my mammogram, repeating that test, I decided it was important for me to come and see him. And he asked me to, at that time, he asked me to come to work for EJI, and I accepted. But the connection there, I think the connection spans even more than that, because of the rich history between Lowndes County and Montgomery. And part of what EJI has done is documented lynchings throughout the U.S., including in Lowndes County. And part of that is a soil collection. So we were given biographical information on people that were lynched, and we would go to the areas where they were lynched, and we actually would go and take soil from that area, and it was stored in jars, and it represents the people that were lynched there. And the connection between that soil, the soil collection there at EJI, and as Brian so eloquently put it, is that the soils there, the soils were the reason that people were brought there in the first place. And it was the reason that my family members were brought to that area in the first place, because the soil was so rich. And then, of course, to be able to control the labor, a lot of people's blood was shed there, because people wanted to maintain some form of slavery. If they didn't call it slavery, it was sharecropping. And now it's basically you're essential workers. So it doesn't matter that you can die, but you got to go to work. And now this same soil is the soil that prevented Pamela Rush from having access to wastewater treatment, because the soil holds water. But beneath that soil, especially in Pamela's case, we find that we find those high water tables too, because some of the regions of Lowndes County have a lot of water. There's some places in Lowndes County if you were to dig a well, you had to go down at least 1,000 feet to get below salt water. There's one person in Lowndes County that has a salt water that uses the ponds to grow shrimp. So, if we did a little bit more study, which I haven't done yet, but that's something we may want to look at, is the relationship to Lowndes County and the sea. And maybe there was an ancient sea there at one time.
Wow, that would be amazing to look into.
Yeah.
Catherine, you mentioned Pamela Rush, and I wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit more about your relationship with Pam and also other and the people, the relatives of Lowndes County, Charlie May and Aaron Thigpen, and anyone else you want to talk about to bring the people to life, bring them in this room.
Well, I think what's really amazing about this is how you can really call the names of folk, because we've been so connected and you've been to a lot of those places. So that's really good. With Pamela, I met a little later. I was involved with Charlie May and Aaron earlier. So I think I'll start with them and then I'll end with Pamela. So we did a house-to-house survey. We had, when we first started doing this work, we found out that there were a lot of people that had been threatened with arrest because they could not afford on-site septic. And we decided we would do a house-to-house survey to determine the extent of the problem. And it was during that house-to-house survey that we learned even more than we thought we knew or that we had been told by the officials from the state health department. And that was only possible because of people like Aaron Thigpen. Because when we organized, we thought it was very important, not even understanding these principles of environmental justice, but making sure that the people that were selected were people that were in the community, who were not elected officials, but who were respected in the community, and folk that were trusted, that the individuals would share this information with them. And Eric Thigpen was actually the youngest person on our team. He was still in his 20s.
Oh, wow.
And Aaron was one of the people that worked with us from the Fort Deposit area. Miss Charlie May lives in Hayneville. And Miss Charlie May was an activist, kind of like Miss Shug. And Miss Charlie May was very, very passionate about revealing to people her own problems with dealing with raw sewage coming back into her house and into her yard. And she was not straight piping. She was on a lagoon system. And this lagoon system, and lagoon systems you will find primarily in rural communities, but they also use them in a lot of developing nations, which makes one wonder, why do they use that here when we have so much more available, but they don't make it available to people who are poor or people of color? So Ms. Charlie May has been very passionate, talking to everybody from PBS NewsHour to former Vice President Al Gore and Reverend Dr. William Barber, expressing her dismay about this problem that she's had for such a long time. And she was one of the people that helped us connect it with health. And then, of course, the youngest member in terms of voices who helped us was, and more recent than Ms. Charlie May, because Ms. Charlie May had been working with us from the very beginning, along with Mary McDonald and all those folk. It's like a cadre of folk in Lowndes County. It wasn't me by myself. It's a cadre of people in Lowndes County. They helped us get this information. But I met Pamela Rush when her sister sent me a message on Facebook and asked me to help her. So I agreed to go and visit with her. And when she told me her story, I couldn't just not do something. And I told her that I wasn't able to correct her situation. She lived in a single wide mobile home that was full of mold and mildew, was decaying, literally falling apart under her feet. And you could, she had holes where she would put rags and a hose to keep animals, wild animals from coming in. And she was afraid of opossums coming in, and she had traps that she would put down to get the animals out of her house. And she was a victim of predatory lending, still paying for a mobile home that her brother and mother had gotten in the 1990s. That was literally not worth what they charged her for, and certainly wasn't worth what she owed on it. And she was also straight piping, and raw sewage was going out the back of her home. And Pamela, like so many other people in Lowndes County, have a lot of health issues. Diabetes is rampant in Lowndes County, so is high blood pressure. A lot of people also suffer from some form of cancer. But in her case, all I knew about was that she was diabetic, because she mentioned that she was afraid of the wild animals coming into her home, because she knew that she didn't want to get scratched by one, not just because she had to get rabies shots, but also because she was a diabetic. And sadly, Pamela caught COVID in the summer of last year, and she died on July 3rd. And she left 2 children, her son Jeremiah and her daughter Bianca. And it's unfortunately, Pamela is just one of so many other families. Her family is one of so many other families that have lost so many people because of COVID. I think COVID and this sanitation issue almost seemed, especially in Lowndes, kind of goes hand in hand. And Lowndes County last year and part of this year had the highest infection and highest death rate per capita in the state of Alabama. And any of us that have worked there and have seen what we've seen are not shocked and surprised by it. And that's why it's so important for us to find solutions to this problem, because, the issues that we think can happen and start in Wuhan and end up in the United States could start in the United States and end up in Wuhan, because we have the conditions to breed that. Mm-hmm. And Pamela, unfortunately, was one of the casualties of all the disparities that we've been trying to fight.
Yeah, I still have really clear memories of visiting Pamela and her children, and it's so terrible. I know that there are a lot of people with us who probably have a lot of questions for you, so I don't want to monopolize all the time, but I do have 2 more questions I want to ask before we open it up. You had spoken a little bit earlier about your faith, and you do talk about it a little bit in Waste. And I just want to lift up this quote from Reverend William Barber II, who you're connected with through the Poor People's Campaign and who we love here in North Carolina. He says, "From the southern states, there have always been strong women who stood and fought for justice. To names like Fanny, Rosa, and Amelia, we must now add Catherine Flowers. Waste is the story of her work to organize communities against environmental racism. The fight is in her soul, and because it is the truth, it will be exposed." And this is just such a powerful quote, and I'm wondering if you can speak more to the role of faith in your own journey.
If it wasn't for faith, if anybody read my journey, people ask me all the time, what kept you going? Every time you encountered an obstacle, it was my faith. And one of the things, everybody knows that my parents were activists, but they were also people of faith. And one of the things I remember, my father was a person who went to bed early. I think it was his military experience that made him so, predictable, that you knew that we were going to eat dinner at this time, and he was going to take a bath at this time, and he was going to read the Bible before he went to bed. He would watch the news, and then he'd go to sleep. But I know that my father probably read the Bible from cover to cover several times, and he could quote it. He was very eloquent, could quote it from memory. I can't do that, but my father could. And oftentimes when people met my father, they thought he was a minister. but he never acknowledged that he had a calling, but I think he had a greater calling, which was to be who he was to the community. But but it was that faith, and there were a lot of things even now as I go through and deal with the losses, and we've had a lot of loss of just memory, and people that were activists in Lowndes County have died due to COVID. Is it is the fact that my parents told me that, whenever we see a mountain, that we pray to either climb that mountain or to go around it. And when I think about, my ancestors, when I first read about COVID, one of the things I did, I went back to look at the census, because I know my father's grandfather, great grandfather, he talked about him a lot. His name is Alec Rudolph. And I went back to look at the census between 1900 and 1920, because the last pandemic that we had was the Spanish flu. And I wanted to see how many relatives lost, who was there in the 1900s, and who was gone by 1920. And a lot of our relatives were still there. And I was wondering, wow, that gave me faith to know that, we could potentially survive this if we did what we need to do. And they didn't have access to MSNBC and CNN and, constant news all the time, or doctors telling them what to do, because they probably didn't have access to that, probably didn't have that many country doctors, and certainly no Black doctors at that time. So I think about all the faith, and sometimes all we had was faith. That was all we had. So I pray a lot, and I often, whenever I face adversity, I stop. I say a prayer. Sometimes I go to sleep if it's at night, and I just have faith that the next day it'll be better. And usually what happens, once I pray about something, I usually get an answer. It may not be the answer that I want, but it gets me closer to where I need to be. So I think that when I deal with folk that other people are afraid to deal with, or people that have, we wonder whether or not they have a sense of humanity, but usually if I pray about it, or I go and I'll find some commonality, and we get there. And I think that my faith is very much a strong part of that. And if you look at the history of, Black America, especially Black people in the South, the church was a strong part of who we were. We look at Dr. King and the civil rights movement. I knew a lot of people that were part of SCLC who talked about praying, even praying when they were walking across the bridge, and the different things that would happen to them along the way, and they would stop and pray. So I'm very moved by that. And I see the power of prayer to compel us, to help us do those things that we think are possible or impossible, and they become even more possible. I mean, the fact that I'm here associated with Duke, I never could have, this is not something that we could have dreamed about, when I was a kid, but I had faith. And one of the things that you all don't know is that when I went to Duke, I was hoping that this would happen, and it did happen. So that was a faith that I had, and I've continued to have the faith throughout the relationships. And the relationship has manifested and grown in such a way that has been very affirming for me. I know I hear a lot about students who talk about, how their lives have changed as a result of going to Lowndes County. But it also affirms my faith and belief that if we take people that are pure in heart and want to do the right thing, and they go there and they develop relationships with local folk, that they can be part of that transformation that needs to take place.
That's so powerful, Catherine. Yeah, I am so grateful for our partnership too, and I know how many lives it's changed. I'm so glad it's evolved into what it is now, and that I get to know you.
Well, it's changed mine too. I can't, I can't really talk about my story and not talk about Duke. Actually, I said, I did a recent talk. I could actually probably write a book just about the Duke experience. But it's been, I think that for all of us, it's been a very, very rewarding, experience. But it also shows what's possible. If the few of us that have done what we've done together, it really shows what's possible, whether is going to Cory Booker's office and visiting with Cory Booker, or whether it's when we were all together, when the Lynching Memorial and the museum was open, and students were there for all of that, or when the very first trip, you remember the very first trip you made to Montgomery, and we went to EJI together. And there was right around the time that Anthony Ray Hinton had been released from his unjust imprisonment, and he got a chance to tell his story. And I remember there wasn't a dry eye in the room. That was these powerful moments that we've shared together. Or when we went to, this was right after the election of 2016, when we went to Atlanta, when the climate change, there was a conference that was supposed to be held by the CDC talking about climate change and health, and and it was canceled by the incoming administration. But Al Gore and Jimmy Carter and Ted Turner decided to have it anyway, and it took place at the Carter Center. And I still have that picture on my Facebook page of the students from Duke who drove there and were with me. And at the end, we all went and met with Al Gore. I think that, it's just all of these experiences, but who could have thought that that all of these affirming experiences would have happened that would have benefited all of us. It wasn't just for the benefit of people in Lowndes County, but also for the benefit of the students and for my own personal benefit. And out of that has developed a type of relationship between those of us that I think we're almost like sisters. And Duke, that people don't know what we do when after the work is over, how we go and eat the fusion Asian food and solve the problems of the world at the same time. So yeah, it's been a very, very rewarding experience for me as well.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. I'm just going to ask one more question, then I promise I'll open it up to everyone. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with the UN Special Rapporteurs on the human rights to water and sanitation, and why you approach your work using a human rights framework?
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, I'm sure everybody's aware of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted for the purpose of trying to end poverty. And one of those Sustainable Development Goals is the human rights to water and sanitation. And I had initially, my first experience dealing with a rapporteur was when Katerina de Albuquerque was the special rapporteur on the human right to water and sanitation. And I was the Universalist Unitarian, UUSC, I can't even think of the acronym right now, but they invited me to come to Washington to present to her about Lowndes County. And then that was the first time. And when I encountered her, I was expecting, it's like when I encountered Brian Stevenson, to me, these people were larger than life. And that's what I was expecting when I encountered them. But Katerina came and started talking to me about Lowndes County. And then the next time, we were in partnership with Columbia University's Human Rights Institute. And one of the persons who had been the attorney working with Katerina de Albuquerque was now at Columbia. And they suggested that we write a letter to the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty, who is coming to the U.S. on his official visit to the U.S., and ask him to come to Lowndes County. And I had to we wrote the letter, they accepted it, but we wanted them to make the connection between the human right to water and sanitation and poverty, because I don't think they were making that connection. But we were able to make that connection, why that was so important. And in making that connection, they came and it made international news. And then later, what we did know, this was faith again. So I got the opportunity to go to Geneva when he gave his report, because he was shocked at what he saw. Actually, the reporter who, today I got a call from the reporter who asked him the question. He wanted to know, had he ever seen what he saw in Lowndes County? Because Aaron Thigpen took us to this area where the raw sewage was all on the ground, and the water lines were running just above where the sewage was. And you could see a child's, they had a basketball goal near there, and you could see toys were all around it. So the reporter said to Dr. Austin, Philip Austin, have you seen this before? And he said, this is uncommon in the developed world. And that made national and international news. And then later, when I was in Geneva, it just so happened to be a time when the United States had decided it was going to leave the Human Rights Council. And the choice of words that was used by Nikki Haley, she left, was cesspools. So when Dr. Austin presented to this world body, he started off talking about Lowndes County. And out of that experience, people from, the press that was present started asking, for interviews, and people were just shocked that Lowndes County, that not Alabama, that the United States, with all of its wealth, had this problem that's associated with third world poverty. So I think the human rights framework not only helped people to understand it, but it also helped people to understand and note that there are poor people, because it's not just Black people in Lowndes County with this problem. There are poor white people with this problem. And now we're learning, because of climate change, it's not just staying in the poor neighborhoods, it's all over. The problem with wastewater and sanitation, that it was only through that lens that people started to pay attention. I think that's how Bernie Sanders heard about it. I understand that Dr. Austin, when he left Lowndes County and he went to Atlanta and then went on to DC to give a report there and meet with some officials. And Bernie Sanders, he described what he saw. And that's what I heard from Bernie Sanders, asking to come and see it himself. So that's, kind of how that evolved. And the human rights framework, I think, is very important for us to understand what the role of government is supposed to be. And that's the job of government, because a lot of times people want to blame the individuals for this. And a lot of things that government should be doing, including COVID. I think if we want to see what happens when you remove the human rights framework and the government not do its job and let everybody do whatever they want to do, then we have a pandemic that where the United States have the largest death rate and infection rate in the world, and nations that don't even have our resources are doing better than we're doing right now, because someone decided they were going to discard the human rights framework and instead just let every man and woman be for themselves and do whatever they want to do. And as a result, we have what we have. We have a pandemic that's out of control. And hopefully now the government will use the human rights framework in order to get control of this and hopefully make COVID a thing of the past.
Yeah, I think we all hope that'll be true.
Yeah.
Well, I want to start off, thank you so much, Catherine. I want to start off with a question from Brian. He's asking what you recommend for students looking to get involved with environmental activism in Durham or in any of their home communities.
I think that, first of all, I think he's right that first you should get involved in your home communities, because I'm sure that everywhere you're going to find environmental issues, especially environmental justice issues. All you have to do is go to the nearest poor community, you're going to see it. So find organizations if you're in Durham, or if certainly in North Carolina. The environmental justice movement started in Warren County, North Carolina. So learn about the history of the environmental justice movement, learn who some of the people are. You're fortunate that there are people that were part of that movement that are still alive. And it'd be great to reach out and talk to some of those people and learn from their experiences. You have people that are recent graduates of Duke, like Danielle Purifoy, that's steeped in that history. And you also have people like Omega and Brenda Wilson, who are always a part of the Duke family whenever something takes place that you can reach out to and learn from them as well. And they are still making history as it relates to environmental justice. We have people that have recently graduated from Duke, like Dr. Brandon Hunter, who was involved in Lowndes County. You can reach out to him and learn from him and maybe even get connected to some of the projects that he's been affiliated with. And lastly, there's the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. I would make it my business to reach out to them and say, you know, I'm a student, I live in North Carolina, and I would like to be involved. And they can tell you where you can be involved. You're in Eastern Carolina, I'm sure there are people there they can connect you with. If you're fighting stuff like, you know, potential pipelines or whatever, there are people like Donna Chavis that they can connect you with. There are people from all over that you can actually work with. But I think the thing that we have to always remember when you go into those communities, find out what they need. Don't go in with all the answers. Find out what they need and how you can serve them.
Yes. Yes. I see a lot of people in the audience going like this. So people support that statement. And also to answer that question as well, if there are students who are on this call who are from Duke, you can contact me. We often send, and I go as well, a group of students to the annual summit of the Environmental Justice Network. So if you're interested in getting involved, please feel free to reach out directly. And if you want help doing that. We have a question from Jules. What have been some of the biggest obstacles in your fight for environmental and economic justice for poor communities?
One of my biggest obstacles has been politicians that represent some of these communities that are ashamed to acknowledge how bad it really is. Because I have to navigate to go around them, because I try not to criticize them publicly. I don't want to do that, because then we'll get into that kind of exchange instead of helping people. But I think that's been a big obstacle. And I think the other big obstacle is in rural communities. A lot of people that are making policies don't really understand rural communities. So it's usually whenever, one of the questions I always get, I had an interview prior to tonight's talk. And one of the questions that I'm always asked is, why aren't people connected to city sewer? They're not in the city. They're in unincorporated communities. So having an understanding of rural communities and how rural communities are organized, I think would be a big step in having more inclusive policy. And I actually wrote an op-ed that published in The Hill on Monday that was entitled Bridging the Rural Divide. And it talks about that's part of the division that exists in this country, I believe. It's because people are well-intentioned, but oftentimes when they write policy, it excludes rural communities where they don't have access unless they're incorporated. Why should they be unincorporated? They're not excluded from paying taxes if they're not part of an incorporated area. So I feel likewise they should be able to get the benefits of their tax dollars just like anybody else. And so that's a big obstacle. And the last obstacle is, as it relates to wastewater and sanitation issues, is that people don't really know how bad it is and how bad it is in their own states. And everybody assumes it's just Lowndes County, and that's not true. Or it's just the South, and that's not true. So that's an obstacle. I think that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, and hopefully we will be able to very soon come up with some real numbers on how many people are impacted by this, so that the policymakers can know how we need to address it.
Mm-hmm. The next question actually is coming from Ryan Juskis.
Hi, Ryan.
He says, "Hi, Catherine. It's so good to read your book and to see you here. You write about this quite a bit in the book, but I'd love to hear you talk more about it here. What is the role of science, research, and writing in this work? Assuming many of us in here are students and scholars, what kind of role can we play in this kind of environmental justice work? What are the risks? What are the opportunities? What should we know if we'd like to get involved in this way?
That's a very good question. I think that what students and academians can do is to verify what people on the ground already know. So we have to assume that, because oftentimes we go in there with preconceived notions because of what's in the book. And a lot of what you're going to find in these rural communities have not been written about, because people have been regurgitating old knowledge that has left so much out. But for an example, one of the partnerships that I can hold up is our partnership with Baylor's National School of Tropical Medicine. You know, the fact that Dr. Hotez, who is now like one of the leading authorities on the coronavirus because he's an infectious disease specialist, when I reached out to him and I sent him an email about what was happening in Lowndes County and what I thought, and I asked him an educated, I think it was a guess, and the guess was, is it possible that there's something in Lowndes County that American doctors are not taught to look for because they don't expect it to be here? And he said, yes, that's possible. But he was able to use his scientific knowledge and his knowledge as a medical doctor to send his parasitologist there. I didn't even know what a parasitologist was, but to send a parasitologist there to work with us to get what we need to find out whether or not this question, that this hypothesis was correct. And but at the same time, when he came, the first day we went to people's homes, they were reluctant to give him their fecal samples or anything else. But he listened when we told him, you need to stay at the hotel, let us get them, because they're not going to give them to you. They saw him as an outsider and they were not going to trust him. I mean, one of the most personal things you can get from somebody is a fecal sample. And then later, of course, we got blood samples and water samples and soil samples. But it was that relationship with the academic community, with scientists, because we believe in science. And at that time, they were using PCR technology. That's how they found the hookworm and those other tropical parasites. It was the state health department that actually put something on their website saying that it was not accurate. And do you know how they diagnose coronavirus now? With PCR technology. We were actually ahead of our time. So these were experts in this area, in the academic community, who were scientists, and they worked with local people to verify what people thought, which was there was something going on that they were not testing for. And that's a good example of how, when we go into communities, listen to what the local people are seeing, because there could be things that they're seeing, like in Cancer Alley. When we went to Cancer Alley, one of the things that people wanted was equipment to be able to test the air quality. Mm-hmm. And that's those kinds of things, to be able to use your abilities to verify and to give some kind of credence of what folk have been seeing all the time, because you have the know-how to do that. But they can tell you because they already know, because they see the results every day. But we can kind of use the science to prove it. And that's one of the ways in which I think we can work together. Well, the risk, I think the risks are we can uncover something that people won't like it. Like there's some people that did not like what we uncovered, but it was the truth. But now here I am, I got a MacArthur Award because of uncovering that. And I think that we have to be concerned about how it's going to impact the environment, how does it impact health, and how do we come up with solutions to that? And that's a good way to use your knowledge.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Catherine. There is a question here about someone who is in Alabama or from Alabama and is often disappointed by the political choices that are made in the state, and how do you keep your hope alive there? Do you see reason to have optimism that the political tide will ever turn more progressive, perhaps through an alliance of progressive whites and people of color?
That's the hope. That's the hope. I actually, 2020 was a blur because, most of us, couldn't get out and gather like we used to. But in 2019, the state Public Service Commission had decided that it was going to raise what was called the solar tax, make it harder for people to get solar, more expensive. And when we went to the Public Service Commission meeting, we were shocked, and they were too, at how people came from around the state. This is in 2019, came from around the state, and they represented all walks of life because they were opposed to them raising that solar tax, because they wanted to be able to get have access to solar panels or solar energy if they wanted to do that without having to pay the power company a big fee in order to have that kind of access. So that's one of the things that gave me hope. The other thing that gives me hope is that the city of Huntsville is going to at some point become the largest city in the state of Alabama. And because of what's going on in Huntsville and the progress that's being made there right now, I think that's going to change. The Huntsville-Madison area is going to change because of people coming in, especially young families coming in. And the other thing that gives me hope is that look at Birmingham and the mayor. Look at Montgomery. Montgomery elected its first ever Black mayor. And one of the things that happened last year is these Confederate monuments started coming down. Mm-hmm. And even some of the newspapers started apologizing because of the roles that they played in racial terror and how they upheld some of it in many cases. So although we still have some folk who have made the national news being negative, I think that we're more and more positive is going to come out of it. And hopefully the young people will take us out of this identity crisis that has forced people to want to go back to the days of the Confederacy. But I don't think that's everybody in Alabama. I think that some people in Alabama got a reason to be ashamed of what is going on right now, instead of us dealing with progress. One of the things that happened, that I know that people will snicker when I say this, but I think that there is some value in medical marijuana. But Alabama just got out of committee in the Alabama Senate. I never thought that would happen. These are things that if whatever progress we can find, we'll take it. So I think that it's going to be a slow process, but ultimately Alabama is going to come out of its Confederate state of mind. I believe that, and I have hope that based on these little glimmers of things that are happening.
Catherine, I know that there are a number of students on this call, and I wonder if you would take a moment to talk a little bit about student activism, your activism in high school and college, and so many when you were a teacher. Could you speak a little bit to the role of activism in your life and making sustainable change?
Well, I've just never been the kind of person. Well, first of all, I think I've always been. My ex-husband used to say, I remember we went to see The Color Purple many, many years ago. Some of you that weren't even born when The Color Purple came out, but we were standing in line. We were in Oklahoma. We were in Lawton, Oklahoma, and most of the people coming out of the theater were white. And everybody, maybe that's why they stopped and talked to me, because I was a Black person there. But everybody was telling, you better take out for your handkerchief. This is going to be a tearjerker. Mm-hmm. Everybody that had an opinion, people were so touched by, they were stopping and telling me. And he said, what is it about you to make people always come up to you? So everywhere I've ever gone, and I could, you kind of saw that in the book, that at some point people would come to me and share and tell me about an issue. And somehow I felt compelled to do it. And right there in North Carolina, when I was teaching in Hope County schools, I remember my Lumbee students, I had never heard of Lumbees before, the Lumbee Nation before. And I remember two young ladies came to me and they said, Ms. Flowers, we're always celebrating everybody else's history and nobody is celebrating ours. And they started telling me about their history, and they started telling me about Henry Bailey Lowry and some other folk heroes of the Lumbee Nation. And one student copied a book and brought it to me for me to read it. And I said, "What do you want to do? What can I do to change this?" And she said, "We should have a powwow. That's how we celebrate our history." So here I was, a Black teacher at the school, pushing for the powwow, and I got approval from the school board. From the not the school board, but from the superintendent's office to host this powwow. And I learned a lot about Lumbee history as a result of that. And I got letters from parents thanking me for doing that, for hosting this powwow. And I suspect it was the first ever powwow that they had at this school. And one parent, this is when my daughter was very young, she was a baby at the time, and a parent made a dream catcher and gave it to me and told me the story of the dream catcher and told me to hang it over her crib to keep out the bad dreams. So, it was, and I remember that to this day. But it was always that kind of situation. And I guess because I came from activist parents and I came from Lowndes County, it's just that it's hard for me to accept injustice, no matter who the victim is. It's just hard for me to accept injustice. And I feel like I've been gifted with the skills to be able to navigate and find solutions for folk. So when I think that's my, back to my faith, part of my faith tradition, if you have talents, you use your talents. If you don't use your talents, you lose your talents. So I use my talents to help other people. And I guess my talent is to be able to navigate and try to find solutions or find resolution and hopefully reconciliation whenever people are dealing with those kinds of injustices. And that's been my life as an activist. And I'm sure it's going to continue beyond the wastewater situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of a quote that I actually shared with you this morning, just that I was struck by in the book, because throughout your life, you take a stand against structural racism in the education system, in the military, in the healthcare system, just to name a few. And after taking on racism in the military and getting and advocating on your husband's behalf and getting him discharged, you wrote, "I learned the audacity needed to challenge structural racism, no matter where it appears." And I was just really struck by that and wondered if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, and here I was in Lawton, Oklahoma, didn't know anybody, and it was really, had just gotten married. My husband and I had been married 2 months when he suffered a head injury. And I was also in school because when they called me was the first day that I had gone to class at Cameron University. And he had amnesia, and I was like, amnesia, that's something you see on television. So I had to learn how to deal with that pretty fast, but I also saw they were doing everything they could to kick him out and not acknowledge what was wrong. So I had to do research, and back then you didn't have computers. You couldn't get on the computer and go and Google the stuff and find the information. So I had to spend time in the library. I had to reach out to doctors who gave me access to information. I contacted the National Head Injury Association, who gave me the name of a doctor who's an expert in Texas, in Austin, that I consulted with, who was at UT Austin. My activist background kicked in to help, because otherwise, we even got orders to go to Germany while he was on medical leave. That didn't make sense. Mm-hmm. Because you can't do that. They were doing everything they could instead of dealing with the problem. I guess they just didn't want to be wrong. It's like executing somebody who is innocent. And they didn't want to be wrong, although all the evidence suggested otherwise. And at every turn, I had to be involved, and I had to fight it. And fortunately, I was a member of the church. I can tell the story now. I was a member of the local church, and one of the persons who worked in when you're in the military, it goes before medical board. That's the way it was then. I don't know whether it's still that way, but you had to go before the medical board to determine the outcome, whether or not the person would be boarded out of the military or remain in the military. And they told me that his medical board had been turned down. So, but they didn't know that one of the persons who worked in the medical board office was one of my church members. And I went to him and I asked him, when did that decision come back? He said, we haven't even sent it off yet. So it was at every turn. And what I ended up having to do, what stopped it, was that I reached out to the office of Walter Fauntroy, who was the DC delegate to Congress in Washington. And when I reached out to him to tell them, because somebody worked in his office that was from Montgomery that I knew, who had also been a part of SNCC. And he sent a cable to the Pentagon and said nothing was going to happen. Nothing was supposed to happen to this soldier unless his office knew about it. And that's when they got scared and knew they had to do the right thing, because somebody else on the outside was looking. So activism, I think, is part of this. What happened to him is part of what we're seeing now. I just saw where some Black Lives Matter folk got into it with some people, got in a counter demonstration with the Proud Boys. The Black Lives Matter people were arrested and the Proud Boys were not. I mean, it's like what happened on January 6th, compared to young people marching in front of the White House and using the military to disperse them. And they were marching peacefully. And people that were violent were able to walk away. And I know that many times that we have gone together to the Capitol and gone in those federal buildings there on Capitol Hill, there's been not one time when we were not stopped and had to go through metal detectors and everything. I mean, students from Duke and professors from Duke that were accompanying me to get inside. But those people were allowed to go in and tear things up and walk away. And that is part of the structure, those kinds of structures we have to dismantle. Because I think that despite the flawed history that we have, I think the best example that we have in the United States, the best example that we have for justice is the Constitution. You just have to make it available, and the rights and privileges that go along with it available for everybody.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Zoe. I'm wondering if Ms. Flowers sees the relationship between urban and rural development, and if there is any way their needs can be met mutually.
Of course. I think they should be met mutually. We don't have a choice. I think one of the things that we do a lot of in the United States is that we feel like it's got to be one or the other. Why can't it be both? Mm-hmm. Why do we have to choose the cities over the rural communities? We're all the U.S. That's how we get division. And we have to find a way we make it seem like we can only fight one problem at a time. But we can do better than this. And I think that may be part of the way to do this. And that's why I've been writing these op-eds and hopefully placing them where people that are making policy can see it, so we can address it. When I was served on the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force this past summer, where we came up with a lot of the policies that was announced by the Biden administration this past week, a lot of people that were there were coming from an urban perspective, and I was probably the only person there that was from a rural community. But I made sure that when we talked about green infrastructure and we talked about climate change and environmental justice, that we also talked about rural communities as well. And that when we started prioritizing where the funding goes, that it will go not just to urban areas, but also to rural areas. The way urban communities can work with rural communities, there are certain resources in rural communities, in urban communities that rural communities don't have. We gladly have sister city relationships with everybody around the world. Let's have sister city relationships with people in these rural communities. Mm-hmm. Where people have access to grant writers, and people have access to sustainability officers and so forth. If we partner internally to solve these problems, I think we will get to the solutions a whole lot quicker. Mm-hmm. And I think it's possible.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Stepping back a little bit, I know that there are also folks on this call who are connected and also who were very inspired by John Hope Franklin. And I know that you were as well. And that his book, From Slavery to Freedom, had a huge impact on your life. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about that and also your passion for history.
Well, yes, I've always loved history, I guess, because, my father, if he had an education, he probably would have been a history teacher or a lawyer. But he was, had he gone to college. But he told us stories about our ancestors and told us stories about, he was like an oral historian, passing down things from his grandfather. And a lot of that oral history now, I get to use it and verify it when I'm, doing my research on my family tree. But with John Hope Franklin, when I was thirsty for Black history. When I was in school, we had Black History Week, which became Black History Month. And I was always thirsty, wanting to know more and more and more. And when I got to college, I took a Black history class, and the book that we used was From Slavery to Freedom. And I just remember it so much. One of the things that really stands out to me, because I had a professor, his name was Dr. Norman Walton. Dr. Walton had been in the military during World War II. He had an interesting perspective on history, but he would talk about the things in Dr. Franklin's book, and he's had so much reverence for Dr. Franklin that I think he passed that reverence on to me too. They even had a display in the building where we had the history classes, and they had Dr. Franklin's book in there. Mm-hmm. And in the book, he talked about Mansa Musa, and he talked about Songhai and how Mansa Musa, and I think there's a movie being made about Mansa Musa now, and how he took the Hajj, and when they took the Hajj and how much they had so much gold and how people talked about that for years after the Hajj. And later in life, I got a chance to meet Dr. Franklin. There was he was older by that time. And they had the Association for the Study of African American Life and History had one of their conferences in Detroit, and I was teaching in Detroit at the time. And I remember going to I remember going there because I wanted to meet him and hear him. And he gave me a copy. They had reissued the book. And I never had a hardback version, but he gave me a hardback version of the book, and he autographed it for me. So again, we talk about faith and things that are in divine order. I never could have imagined that I would be working with the Franklin Humanities Institute years later. So all of these things are so connected in such ways that I never could have imagined. But yeah, I love history. Everything I look at it through the lens of history, because I think that history helps us to understand. I think we have to, when we look at trying to understand what's going on, even as it relates to environmental justice, I think the humanities is very, very important to that, because we have to tell the stories. Even the way I wrote my book, I had to write if I had wrote the book just as a plain academic book writing about waste, we wouldn't be talking today because nobody would be interested in it. You know, we've had just plain folk that have read the book because the book, it gave voice to different stories.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing that and using the skills of storytelling, which I learned from my father, the griot, helped me to tell this story in such a way. Now I'm hearing from people from other parts of the world who are talking about their own stories, who are related and connected to it. Because we have to, I think a liberal arts education is very good and still has a role. And I was fortunate to have a liberal arts education, but also the role of the humanities, I think, is very essential, because even in environmental justice, had I not written this book, we wouldn't be talking about waste the way we're talking about it now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and that also makes me wonder too, why, talking about sharing your history, why did you decide to write this book now instead of 5 or 10 years ago?
Well, I wanted to write 5 or 10 years ago, but I'm glad I didn't write 5 or 10 years ago, because so many things have happened in the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have been able to write about. I think that there were things I needed to see. I didn't understand that the wastewater problem was a problem in other parts of the country. I didn't even understand this connection to other parts of the world. And one of the things that I think made me realize how important this was, not just a parasite study, but Flint. You know, what happened in Flint, Michigan, because then I started writing more, and I ended up writing for the Anglican Review. And the title of the piece that I wrote was entitled "It's Not Just Flint." So I think the Flint show, and I think what I said at the time, that Flint showed failing infrastructure. But in Lowndes County, we were dealing with no infrastructure. But now I realize it, you know, if I had to write that again, it wasn't just failing infrastructure in Flint. It was also failing infrastructure in Lowndes County and failing infrastructure, sanitation infrastructure in places around the United States. And one of the things I've learned since then, through Reverend Barber, and I have to give him a lot of credit because I met Reverend Barber and was connected to people with Kairos at Union Theological Seminary. And I got a chance to go on visits to areas prior to the launching of the new Poor People's Campaign. I went through Appalachia and I got a chance to see firsthand and learn about the history of Appalachia and how that was connected to environmental justice and also climate justice because of mountaintop removal and the history of coal and how it exploited the labor of so many people that were sick because of their exposure. And I had an uncle who died from black lung disease. So I understand he was a coal miner in Birmingham. And then, of course, we went to, and because of my relationship with the Poor People's Campaign, I also had the opportunity to go to Standing Rock, which, as you know, was one of the milestones in my life. So all of those things I wouldn't have been able to write about. And I think it wouldn't have been, at least for me, it would have been a less interesting book, but there's some experiences I needed to have so that I could connect the dots now in a way that I could not have connected the dots 10 years ago. And even when I wrote the book, I wrote the book in 6 months.
That's amazing.
Yeah, because it was my story. I think if it takes 2 years for you to tell your story, then you're telling somebody else's story. So I was writing my story and writing the story. And fortunately, a lot of what I wrote about, we could find news articles to verify it. So that was a good thing. But in writing this story, there were some things that I didn't know that I didn't realize it was going to be so timely for it to happen at this time. That goes back to faith, because I'm writing about, when my literary agent called me and said, Catherine, this book, she thought it was going to be a bestseller. I can't tell you how many books have been sold. So I don't know whether it's a bestseller or not, except for on Amazon. But it is, she called me, she said, Catherine, this is going to be a bestseller. This is so timely. But she called me. This was around the time that people were marching in the streets because of what had happened to George Floyd. What I didn't know is that George Floyd had connection to Hope County, North Carolina. That that's where the second memorial service took place. That's where his family had started from, in Hope County, North Carolina. I had no idea. So all of these connections that I'm seeing, even, you know, some of the tactics that I've seen, the nonviolent tactics that I've seen as it relates to confronting the police, who is very heavily militarized. I saw a lot of that used at Standing Rock because they were peaceful protesters and the police were heavily militarized. You know, if I had not seen it for myself, I would not believe that that could happen in the United States of America. So it is through those experiences that I was able to connect the dots in the book and also talk about climate change and climate justice and how all of this is related. And I think now I don't have to convince people. There's so many other people that they can connect the dots and see it too. And that's why I think that whatever it was that drove me to write it at this time, felt that this was the time for me to do it, because it was, people are receiving it and they see it and they're not like shaking their heads in disbelief. They can see how it's all connected.
Yeah. You do an amazing job of really connecting that and making it so clear for folks. I know we are getting close to the end of our time, so I wanted to ask one final question. I know throughout this and in your book, you talk a lot about your relationships and learning from Native students and Native communities, and also share about kind of the wisdom of making choices now that will have an impact 7 generations to come. And I just wondered if you wanted to kind of close out our talk together about your hopes for what we could be doing now, what you're doing, what we can all be doing so that we can still have a sustainable earth for our children's children, 7 generations to come.
Well, you know, as a grandparent, I think it's very important that, you know, I'm concerned about clean air and clean water. And I've gone to places where I see that people don't have either one, whether it's in Flint, Michigan, or whether it's in Detroit where they're having water shutoffs, or whether it's in Allensworth that looks like Allensworth is in the Central Valley in California, where it looks like Lowndes County with no water, where they have taken big growers have taken so much water out of the ground that the naturally forming arsenic there has made the water undrinkable. So, you know, or even my own experiences where I've seen, you know, last year where when those hurricane force winds hit Lake Charles, Louisiana, by the time the winds got to Montgomery, it was still hurricane force winds. And I was concerned whether or not my house was going to be able to withstand it. So I'm very concerned that we have to have a sustainable world, a world that can sustain life. You know, Earth is our common home. And most of us are not going to be able to get on a spaceship and go somewhere else because we haven't found a place that can sustain life other than Earth at this point. And I think that we have a responsibility to maintain what I would call some semblance of a Garden of Eden, what I saw when I was growing up in Lowndes County when I could live off the land. I shouldn't be the last generation to be able to experience that. And we have to make sure that all of our children, I mean, if you can just imagine, I think it was Al Gore that talked about his grandchildren and having to wear a face mask in California because of the wildfires and the smoke. And how, because they were babies at the time, they couldn't find face masks big enough for them. We don't want that to become the new normal. And in order to prevent that from happening, we have to start doing things in such a way that we have to think about 7 generations to come. And I've even gone even further. One of the things I'm going to write about, that if we think about Earth as a womb, and we're all in it. And if we believe, for those people that believe in protecting life, then we have to also believe in protecting the life-giving force of Earth and not destroy that. And that's why, I'm really fighting for all of those grandchildren that I will never see. And we have to stay in this fight, or otherwise we could very well be the last. We see what's happening with COVID. If we ignore and pretend like this is a hoax, we'll have more death than we should have. But if we get together like people got together, they created that vaccine in warp speed, we can do the same thing to save life on Earth for 7 generations to come.
Thank you so much, Catherine. This has been such a powerful evening. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you for your witness and your work and your passion and your faith and all of the impact you've had on so many people and students. It's just, you are incredible, and we are all so grateful to be connected to you and for the work that you do.
Well, thank you. It goes both ways. It goes both ways. I'm thankful for my Duke family, who has been a part of my journey, and hopefully will continue to be a part of my journey in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening.